just like one point, one place on your body where the breath, so you can either focus on the tip of your nose or your mouth or your abdomen. And then just focus your mind there on the sensation. Breathing in, and the sensation of breathing out. Keeping your mindfulness on that, on the breath. also kind of we call set our motivation. Especially first, we can think of the Buddha. One of those. Take refuge. So both for refuge, we first, the meaning of refuge, right, means first you are concerned or afraid of something. So it's our own suffering and the suffering of others. So we're concerned about our own suffering, we're concerned about the suffering of others. And so then with a sense of faith, we take refuge in the Buddha, in the Dharma, especially the inner realizations of Dharma, which are the actual refuge, and in the Sangha community. And we think that we're discussing some Dharma today in order to progress on the path. And why? For sure it's to free ourselves and also others who suffer. So the purpose today, talking together, contemplating, meditating, is compassion. So just take a moment to connect first with a sense of compassion towards yourself, wanting to free yourself from suffering, the causes of suffering. And then think of countless others who are also suffering. And so then our purpose is to together generate some wisdom to help free ourselves and all others from suffering. So try to connect with that kind of thought or feeling. Compassion for yourself, compassion for others. Thinking, feeling that this time, this class or this session together is my motivation is compassion to liberate myself and others from suffering. And also my motivation for today, for the whole day, is to live with a sense of compassion. Compassion, of course, for myself, and then also for countless others. So a sense of warmth, kindness, concern, empathy. Try to live with that kind of motivation today. We can come into a more interactive mood for a while. Start our subject, particular to today. So last time we talked about the reason, some general some reasons why, one needs a spiritual teacher, and then also the benefits of relating well to a spiritual teacher and the disadvantages of not relating. So we talked about that last time. So I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, but I want to add on one more thought. Right? Like last time we used one analogy, right? Of we were talking about if you're doing something, especially when you're doing something that's both complicated and very important, then you need a teacher. Right? And actually, then we were saying how even, just briefly, right, we were saying how, actually even with simple tasks like riding a bicycle, actually somebody usually teaches you, right? But then especially when, then I use two analogies, like when you think of something that's really important and complicated, like for example, a brain surgeon, that you wouldn't want somebody operating on your brain who hadn't studied with somebody else. If they said, I just read a couple books, that wouldn't be a good sign. And the same thing with an airline pilot. Right? Like if you're flying on a 747 and the person, I use that analogy, right? I said if you're flying on a 747 and the captain said, well, I've read 6 or 7 different books about airline flying, so it'll be okay. That wouldn't be a good sign. And if he said, and I played one of those video games, you wouldn't be satisfied. You'd want somebody who had studied with other people, right? And the same with a brain surgeon or something like that. So when a task is both dangerous, important, and complicated, then it's really important to have a teacher in any field, right? So actually, usually we need teachers even for simple things, right? Like riding a bicycle or building something. And then if it's going to be a complicated task, then we really need a teacher. So, I'm not going to go over all that again, but then I want to say something else, because today I want to get into actually before I get into the actual teaching, I want to share some more maybe either personal or a kind of psychological reflections, because I think it's useful, because this is relating to a guru, right? Guru is a very foreign subject from our cultural perspective, and I think it can be confusing. So I thought it would be good to just talk about it a little bit, not, we'll go through the formal subjects, but I just thought it's good to pause for a moment and reflect together, because well, actually, so I want to start with this, the purpose of relating to a teacher is, there are numerous purposes actually, right? One is you learn, because the analogy I was giving though of a surgeon, right? Then you can think, okay, so the purpose is on the one hand it's to gain knowledge, right? So if we relate to a teacher, a spiritual teacher, we're gaining a certain amount of knowledge. But that's not the only purpose, right? There are other purposes to having a teacher, and I want to share a few, and actually I was trying to think of analogies to this, and it was hard to find analogies, but then I thought of one. I remembered when I was I'm not really supposed to talk about myself, but I will a little bit, just because it's a typical analogy, I think, to relate to it. I remembered when I was a kid, I liked playing basketball, and I was a pretty good student. And then I remember reading a book by Bill Bradley. He was a Knick, a member of the New York Knicks, and he was also a Rhodes Scholar. And I can remember this. I'd be outside playing basketball, and then I'd think, well, I'm tired. And then I would think, well, Bill Bradley would have stayed out here another hour. And then I think, he did it? Okay, I can stay out one more hour. And then after practice, I would think, well, I could kind of skimp on my homework and just do the math that the teacher's going to check tomorrow. And then I'd think, well, he did all his homework. I guess I should try harder, or something like that. Right? So there was some sense of inspiration. You know what I mean? Here's somebody who, I was 10, 12 years old or something, but you think, oh, there's somebody who he could do that. He did it all, right? He was that good, and he practiced that hard. And I remember this part of his book where he said, he would be practicing, and then he would think he would go in, and then he'd say, well, somebody somewhere is out still practicing, and I'm not going to go in before they would. He would sort of imagine that, and I would think, that's pretty cool. Okay, I'm going to try, so there's a sense of inspiration, right? And because in Tibetan Buddhism we talk about blessings, right? We say, oh, you receive the blessing of your guru, and I just think that could be, on the one hand I like that term, and on the other hand I think it's confusing. What does that mean, actually? There is, from an experiential point of view, because actually what would it mean to receive a blessing of your guru? And then I thought, in a way though, that's what they're talking, they're not talking, because a blessing, it could seem I guess my concern is this, is that if you think of receiving the blessing, you could imagine what's that, remember that, there's an old movie with Charlton Heston where the lights come down and the bush starts lighting up. You could think it means that, right? Oh, I'm going to receive a blessing, and then there's going to be this halo, and something's going to happen. But actually, I think that really what they're talking about with the blessing thing is something closer to what I experienced when I was a kid, and I thought, well, I'm going to stay out here and keep practicing. A sense of inspiration. I think that's a little closer to the experience of what they're getting at when they say receiving the blessing of your guru. Is that you look at somebody, right? You look at your teacher, and you think, wow, they can do that. Look how, they're patient when somebody's rude to them, right? You watch somebody I remember watching somebody be rude to Lama Zopa Rinpoche and then watching his reaction. And then go, wow, I'd never seen anybody. Most people I'd seen would try to retaliate. A few people would walk away. Some people I knew would sort of walk away, but mostly they were conflict avoid. They didn't like conflict. But then I watched Lama Zopa, and he went right towards the person, and gave them 5 times more attention than he was giving anybody else, and was, and acted way more loving and kind to them than he was to anybody else. like it was like as soon as the person was rude and mean to him, it was like, that was the person he was going to practice. And I thought, and I'm just saying, like, and I thought, wow, okay, like I'd never seen anybody do that before, but that you can do that, wow, like. So I mean, and it's a quality, and like that was I consider that a blessing. Like then, when somebody was rude to me, I could think back to that and think, kind of like the Bill Bradley thing, right? Like, well, Amazopa did it, I could do that. Like, it's not that hard. It's a little hard, but it's not that hard. Like, you know what I mean? Or like you see, I remember like or I'll give another analogy. Like I have all these thick Dharma books in my house. Like I have a lot of thick ones that people come to class there or something. And then sometimes I would think, well, I'd rather read a biography. Like I like reading biographies of lamas, or like they're thin books. Then I saw those thick ones, and I thought, oh, that seems a little hard. Like they're kind of long, and they have language like I was reading some of them. They have that language, right? We were on Facebook about that, right? Where they'll say, the meaning of the definendum and the like all these words. I was like, I don't even know the English. Like I couldn't even. And then what was the one? What's the predicate of the probonundum? I was staring at that. I'm going, wow, like I could read English and I don't know what that means. I had to go look it up. And like, so I'm just saying, that's like, and then I thought, oh, it seems daunting. But then I would look at Khenze Rinpoche, who's 76 years old, right? And he would have 4 different thick books, and he was comparing all of them. And I'd be like, okay, if he can do that, come on, like I can read a book. Like even if it's thick and looks hard, he's reading 4 at the same time. Like. So I'm just saying, like, I think that's a blessing, is what I'm getting at. But blessing doesn't mean, like, so we say, oh, I received the blessing of my teacher. So I think at the beginning, because nobody explained, like, I was, like, sort of hoping that there would be some kind of light rays happening. It's like, that sounds cool, blessing. Like, but actually, blessing really is, I think, like that. In other words, it's something very practical. And Khenze Rinpoche says, he also says faith. He says, we say, oh, you have faith. And again, like, I think because it's just a different cultural context. I got confused anyways. That's why I wanted to talk about it. Like, because I would think faith, and I would think of like, I don't know, I guess I would sort of think of, honestly, I guess my own image of faith would be Catholic women sort of crying or something. That was my, I guess like culturally, that was my sort of, I thought, because, I don't know, like that was my, like usually, something like I would think of a Catholic woman in Europe or in South America sort of crying, in front of a cross, and I was sort of, that's what faith is, I guess. I don't know, like. But what Khenze Rinpoche said, actually, I like this. He said when you go to the store, right? Like he was, I'm going to elaborate. He doesn't buy stuff, so he didn't go into much example. But and somebody said, or when you're out and somebody says, this iPad is awesome. It's like the best thing in the world. It's so much better than a laptop. It's so much lighter. You can do everything with it. And you go, really? And they go, yeah, it's great. And then you see an advertisement for iPad, they're like flipping it around, and it's showing, like cells or something, whatever, all these things happening, right? So you can learn anything on an iPad. And then you start to go, wow, I want to get an iPad. Like, they're cool. Wow, that'd be great. I wish I could have an iPad. He was like, that's faith. Like, you have some faith that thing is good, right? And so you want to get it, right? And he said there are different levels of faith. The first faith is like where you go, well, that sounds cool. It'd be nice to have one. And then if you keep hearing advertising, right? I'm not particularly, actually, I don't have an iPad, I'm not great. I'm just using an example because that's supposed to be something cool right now, right? So it's the first level where you go, that sounds cool. And then if you keep hearing ads, and let's say all your friends have one, right? And everybody goes, oh, I have an iPad. You don't have an iPad? Why not? So then you would think, I gotta go out and get one. This is like embarrassing, and they're really cool, I should go get, and then finally, like, you reach a level where you go, okay, and you're on your way to Best Buy, I guess, yeah, that's what I was trying to think of Best Buy. So then you're on your way to Best Buy, and you're like, I'm getting one today, I don't care, But Khenze Rinpoche was saying, that's faith. Like, in other words, you have some faith that that's going to make you happy, right? Usually it's misplaced faith, we buy stuff. In other words, because the problem is we buy something like that, and then of course, then usually we're disappointed. Well, it doesn't really do anything my laptop couldn't do. Yeah, it's a little lighter. Then it breaks, and then you have to take it into the Apple store or something, and then it's like a hassle. So I mean, sometimes it can be exaggerated faith, but there's he was saying faith is not something like some esoteric thing that somebody else has. Like, we all have faith in something, right? Some people have faith, right? Oh, if I could just, have a really attractive, whatever, boyfriend or girlfriend, then I'll be happy, right? Like, people have faith in different things, right? People have faith, oh, if I could just get that better job, then I'd be happy. But that's faith, actually. It's something we want, right? And And so the idea would be that when your faith is, so in other words, those are all faith, but so if you develop faith in a spiritual teacher, it's similar, right? In other words, you start to see qualities in them, right, that you like, and then you think, well, I want to have those qualities. Like, I want to develop that kind of, I want to develop patience, right? I want to develop compassion. I want to develop wisdom, something like that. And so you're looking at the person, you're saying, wow, they have these qualities, that's really actually looks quite good. It's like that story of the Buddha, right? After the Buddha had seen a sick person, an elderly person, and a corpse, right? Then he was out from the palace, right? He was that protected prince, we went over this, and then he saw a monk, right? Not really, I guess you can't say a monk, an ascetic. There were, I mean, he wasn't a Buddhist monk anyway, because there was no Buddhist monks, because the Buddha hadn't achieved enlightenment yet, but he saw an ascetic, right? And he looked at that ascetic and he saw a sense of like peace, right? An incredible peace on that ascetic's face, and a sense of tranquility, and a sense of being self-possessed, and being kind of disciplined and peaceful and joyful. And he thought, wow, like, I'm in this palace, everybody's really rich, but we're all miserable. That guy looks like he has something I want to have, right? That was faith. In other words, but it wasn't like it was the same kind of thing as a person who's going out to find a new date or get an iPad or whatever. In other words, it's that he saw something that he wanted, right? And he developed a belief that that would make him happy. Does that make sense? So it's not, so faith is not something like inherently spiritual, and blessings are not something inherently spiritual. Does that make sense? You know, it's like an experiential thing that everybody has, but in this case it's directed to, you know, rather than directing it towards, an iPad, you're directing it towards a spiritual goal or a spiritual, you know, teacher or whatever. So you see, I mean, the difference is what you're directing your faith towards. It's not, the state of mind's the same, actually. Does that make sense, kind of? So I think those things are quite important, because otherwise we get confused, and we think like, you know, that faith is something other than what it is, and that blessings are something other than what they are. We expect something unrealistic then. And then, it's okay if I'm going, I want to share one more like of these, like before I get into the actual teaching, one more personal sort of, it's not really personal reflection, but like reflection, experiential. And it's this, I'm going to start with actually a Buddhist story, but it's not, actually Buddhists don't, I mean Tibetan Lamas don't go into detail about this usually, but I think it's important for us to go into more detail. But I'll start with the Tibetan story. You know, Tibetans, in Tantric Buddhism, they visualize, sometimes practitioners visualize themselves and others as deities. This is a funny story of Tibetans where this guy was visualizing himself as a deity that had horns. And then he visualized it so hard that when he got to a door, he could stop that he thought, I can't fit through the door. and they said, that was ridiculous. You know, Tibetans laughed at him, that's ridiculous, you know, like, it's a visualization, you know. But the reason why I'm telling that story is this, is like, actually I think there's a psychological thing in that story that I want to elaborate on a little bit. And it's this also, you know, sometimes just human beings in general, right, we can take things very concretely and literally, and also we don't have like flexibility of mind. And in general in Buddhist training, you have to have flexibility of mind to do it well. And especially in this thing of relating to a spiritual teacher, you have to also have flexibility of mind. And I want to give an example of what I mean. Like, I mean, again, it would be silly, right? Somebody made a movie like that where, you know, there's a contemplation of Buddhism, seeing all beings as your mother, right? And you know, it's one of the meditations, right, for developing compassion. Right? So in your meditation, you meditate on all beings as your mother, right? But if you then walked out on the subway or like the metro and started hugging people, you know, like, that would be ridiculous, right? In other words, so you have to have a flexibility of mind that recognizes that, and actually, but so if you were doing that practice a lot, right, you're meditating on the kindness of mother beings, right? And then you're on the metro, right? So how do you relate to people? And actually, Buddhism would say, well, you know, externally, you know, be friendly, be nice, but don't, you know, like, be like everybody else, except maybe nicer and more patient, right? Yet in your mind, you're looking at the person and thinking, wow, that's like, you know, if you're actually developing some realization of that, you might be quite moved, actually. You might see some stranger and feel incredibly moved, like, with a sense of intimacy and warmth and affection towards them, but you act normal. And how do you do that, actually, right? It means, for a practitioner of Buddhism, of Tibetan Buddhism like that, right, that you have to be able to, like, hold ambiguity. Again, like, Tibetan Lamas don't use that terminology, but I think it's useful to hold it. You have to be able to hold, like, two different things in your mind and be flexible, right? And recognize both are valid, right? On an interpersonal level, it's valid to act normal. Right? You're on the metro, and if you start doing something, you know, somebody might punch you. And also you might offend them and upset them. That's wrong, you know. But on the other hand, for your own mental training, it's quite useful, right? Because you're trying to develop a sense of warmth and affection and love. So that contemplation is very useful, right? So you walk around feeling love, right? But you don't act on it unless it's appropriate to the situation. You see what I mean? Like there's a flexibility there. So the same thing comes in this one of relating to the spiritual teacher, right? Because, like, you know, on the one hand, let's say if you're in some large meditation, if you're in like the Verizon Center and the Dalai Lama's teaching, right? Well then, it's quite, you know, actually it's fine, right? You can go like, then you can like do the external, like you look like you have a lot of faith, like kind of like the image of the, you know, actually now I can say, oh, it looks like an old Tibetan lady, right? So actually, it's Tibetan sometimes they go, you know, they're crying, and sometimes they actually do also a slurping sound. It's a cultural thing, right? When they're really, it's just some cultural phenomenon, right? So that, then it's quite okay if you want to do that, you can pretend you're Tibetan. But, you know, but if you're, like, you know, but if you go to, I'll give an example, like, sometimes after we would teach here, sometimes we would take Ken Rimshi out to IHOP. You know, he had just taught, right, and it was time to eat lunch, so we'd stop at IHOP. So if I had done that in IHOP, would that have been useful, right? Like, it would have been a bit silly, right? Like, instead we try to help figure out, you know, help him figure out what he would like and how explain it to the waitress because he doesn't speak English, you know. But I guess my point is like they have to hold a flexibility of mind, right? Like if I thought, oh, I have to act like I do in front of the Dalai Lama all the time, that would be totally silly, right? But on the other hand, like if my view of him changed and I thought, okay, when he's teaching, I'll see him as the representative of the Buddha, and when we're at IHOP, I'll see him as some ordinary person. That's not good either, actually, right? So your mind stays the same, but your behavior changes according to the context. So it takes a certain flexibility, right? Which is actually, I'll say, psychologically is a sign of health, actually. That's a sign of being a healthy person. Does that make sense, kind of? Okay, and then actually, okay, so now I'm going to go into the actual teaching part. I just wanted to say, those are like preliminaries. But now to go into the actual, like, more formal teaching, I want to say something about, so having, you know, the first step, right, that we talked about last time, we also talked about the 10 qualities of a Mahayana teacher, and then I briefly mentioned just some tiny bit about that there are also 20 more qualities for a tantric teacher, a teacher of highest yoga tantra, but to look for, right? So our first task is to find a qualified teacher, right? So you don't just, you know, so that's your responsibility, actually, that's the best way to say it. That is our responsibility. Buddhism is very clear about this, and again, because this is, you know, I said this a little bit last time, but it's important. So, you know, that Buddhism doesn't have badges, like the Boy Scouts or something, you know. So it's not like a badge that shows somebody has, you know, they have like, or it's also not like the military, right, where somebody has like a whole bunch of things across their, you know, like 12 badges, and they say, oh, they're a qualified teacher, actually. So it's up to the student to, the student has a certain responsibility to check, right, and to take time to think about it and so on. Because there's not, like, you know, there's not like a thing where there's a certification that Dalai Lama said this person is such and such, right? Like, that doesn't exist in Buddhism, you know, even, because actually, you know, even if somebody's the abbot of a monastery, let's say, right? I mean, that just means they're the abbot of a monastery. It doesn't prove that they're qualified to be your personal teacher. Does that make sense? That's your responsibility to figure out. And so, so that's one thing. But then I want to say another thing. So then once you've chosen, so anyway, so you have to check up. But once you've chosen this is the Buddhist approach. You check up very carefully, and once you've chosen somebody saying, yes, they're my teacher, then they're your teacher. And you stay, and you're not supposed to change that. Now, I already mentioned this thing about flexibility, right? Does that mean that you have to agree with everything they ever say? No. Actually, I was just last night reading where this, I thought it was quite funny. It was a book on tenets, and this Lama, he was commenting. He wrote a book on tenets, right? But his teacher his previous incarnation had written a book on tenets, holding one position, and then his personal teacher had taught him a different position, disagreeing with his previous incarnation. He thought about both and then took a different position. Yeah, still from either of them. He said, no, I think this. You know, in his book, he said what he thought. And so it was funny. He didn't agree with his previous incarnation. He also didn't agree with his teacher. He kind of made up his own stance. That was based on his own reasoning. Right? That's fine. There was it didn't mean that he was disrespectful to his teacher. That's his job, is to think about what his teacher had said and come to his own conclusion. So it's not So it's not saying that I'm just using an actual Buddhist example. It doesn't mean you have to always agree with every stance your teacher takes, um, but it means that you respect that teacher and view them as a Buddha, actually. So how do you view somebody as a Buddha and not agree with everything they say? Well, he did it. Actually, Lama Tsongkhapa did that lots. Lama Tsongkhapa had incredible respect, right? He had total devotion to his teachers, viewing them as Buddhas. But he disagreed with tons of things they said. And he went and did a long retreat, actually, and then propounded, the most important subject probably in Buddhism is emptiness, right? The view of emptiness. And Lama Tsongkhapa disagreed with everybody, actually, right? He wrote, he didn't disagree with Nagarjuna and Chandrakirti, but he disagreed with everybody of his time in Tibet in terms of the view of emptiness. He said, actually, this is how emptiness should be explained, and this is more precise, and he took a very strong stand on that. But he didn't break his guru devotion at all. So I'm just pointing out, like, do you see the flexibility that's there? Like, there is, and I think that's why I said that, is like, I think culturally we have some idea like, oh, they're a Buddha, so you can never say anything that disagrees, but Lama Tsongkhapa did that. And His Holiness the Dalai Lama has done that, actually, right? Like there's, like on that one issue of like, certain practice that people do, he's very openly said, I think, my teacher said this, I disagree. I think it's better people not to do that practice, so, and he's been very strong on that point. There's no disagreement, like, there's no break in his devotion to his teacher, it's just his reasoning, right? Like, so that's the Buddhist view, is that, like, so it's quite complicated. It's not complicated, it's just like, you have to have a flexibility of mind. Does that make sense? And you have to have like an ability to, like, not be fundamentalist in a way. Does that make sense, kind of? Like, because, like, in other words, by fundamentalist, I just mean, like, like, in other words, like, everything is literal and absolute, right? Buddhism doesn't accept that, actually, as an approach. That's not a reasonable approach from a Buddhist perspective. So anyways, does that all make sense? So I want to keep going now. So in terms of this idea of viewing the teacher as the Buddha, right, that's actually what we're going to talk about today, which is, I think, a very controversial subject. I think it should be a controversial subject. But that's the main point, actually, of the Lam Rim teachings, of the stages of the path teachings on Guru devotion. That's the meaning of devotion, in a way. And I want to say something, actually, that's quite interesting, is actually the tradition itself, though, says, there are many things where you're trying to develop what they call a valid cognition, in Sanskrit, a pramana, right? Like emptiness. You're trying to develop a valid cognition of emptiness, right? Or seeing others as impermanent, right? You want to do seeing all phenomena as impermanent. You're trying to develop a valid cognition. And they actually say, in terms of seeing the guru or seeing the teacher as Buddha, you're not trying to develop a valid cognition because you can't, actually. What they're saying is you can't see until you're a Buddha, actually, you can't see a Buddha, or until you're a high bodhisattva in some sense. There is like, actually the Buddha said that the Buddhas are the Dharmakaya, right? The Buddhas are the truth body. So I guess maybe in a sense when you see emptiness directly, you see the Buddha. You could say that, but then you're on the path of seeing, you're quite advanced. So we can't actually see, there is, from a Buddhist perspective, they would say, we cannot develop a valid cognition of somebody as a Buddha. Actually, because that's an extremely hidden phenomena, right? Like, in other words, if you look at Rebecca, right, what's in Rebecca's mind right now? Actually, nobody can know that, right, except Rebecca. But nobody else can know what's in her mind, right? Like, she could be thinking about lunch, or she could be a Buddha who sees all phenomena at the same time. Actually, we can't, nobody else can perceive that directly, right? Does that make sense? So you can't develop a valid cognition of that, actually. So the idea here is that it's a mental training. That's the point here. So seeing the guru as Buddha is not trying to develop a valid cognition of the teacher as Buddha. It's training your mind in a certain way and why? This is the important point here, that the teachings are actually very clear on. Why would you do that? Because it benefits you. That's the purpose of this, right? So in other words, and how does it benefit you, right? Like, actually it goes back to what we were talking about earlier, right? About the inspiration and there was all those things, right? Like, in other words, because if I had thought, when I was a kid, right? If I had thought, Bill Bradley's a chump, like, whatever, he was wasting his time, and who cares, and that was stupid, right? Well, then I wouldn't get any inspiration at all, right? Whereas you have to see the qualities of the other person to get inspiration, and the amount of qualities you see in the other person determines how much inspiration you gain. Does that make sense? And Buddhism is very practical in this way, and there is so, like, in other words, it's not about, like, do you get this feeling that it's not about, I think it's a very important point, that it's not about a valid kind. In other words, actually, like Khenpo Rinpoche, Lama Zopa Rinpoche, and Pabonka Rinpoche, and Lama Tsongkhapa, they all say, it's actually not, it has very little to do with the teacher. In other words, at the beginning it does, because you have to check up, right? Do they have the qualities? Do they have these lists and that list? At the beginning you do that. Later, it's not so important, actually. In other words, because the point is what benefits you. That's, at that point, it's a mental training to benefit you. It's not really about, it's not as much about them as it is about your own training. And, give one more. I'm jumping back and forth a little bit. I'm jumping away from Buddhism a few times because I think it's hard to do this. So I just want to give one more analogy here. You know, if you read Shakespeare's sonnets, right, his love sonnets, right, there are always these things like, you know, your eyes are like the sun and the moon, right, you know, whatever, all these, like, you know, and always the implication is you're the most beautiful woman on the planet, right? Every sonnet has that implication. Was she literally the most beautiful woman on the planet? No, very unlikely, right? And when the person reads that sonnet to his lover, right, does he believe that she's the most beautiful woman on the planet or not? In a way, yes. I mean, if he's actually, if he's 16, he does. You know, right? And you know, in other words, or if he's foolish, then he does, right? But if he's a little bit mature, he both does and doesn't. Actually, in other words, a psychologically mature person does and does. Or a psychologically mature person can say, well, to me. In other words, if you ask the person honestly, they would say, to me, they are, right? That's actually the right answer, right? You know, is that literally true? You know, compared to a supermodel and compared to whatever, I don't know, whatever. You know, who cares? Like, in other words, that's irrelevant, right? The person can recognize, can hold the ambiguity of that, right? That to me it is, because that's the nature of being in love or something, right? You know, so training in guru devotion is a bit like that, actually, and not in the sense of being in love for things they're beautiful, but in the sense of, like, for me, that's what's true, right? And nobody else has to see. It doesn't matter that other people see that or don't see that. It doesn't matter. What matters is that, you know, because when the lover sees the beloved that way, right? Well, it does something for them, actually, right? And actually, they probably don't want everybody to see that way, or it would create a lot of problems, right? Then they'd have fights all the time or something with other people, right? Staying away from them. But the point is that it's an emotional state, right? And that's part of what this thing of guru devotion is. So I'm just trying to you get the flavor there? I'm using these analogies to try to get a flavor across. That the idea is that for the person training in guru devotion, they look at their teacher and they contemplate in order to develop that sense of a relationship with the Buddha. Does that make sense? And I want to say one more thing, right? Like, I'll give one more analogy. If I'm at a dinner table, right, and I offer, you know, Buddhists are supposed to do this, right? So somebody serves dinner, right? So you think, okay, I offer this to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha, right? You visualize the Buddha and offer it, right? Like, if I'm visualizing the Buddha in front of me, and then the hostess, let's say I'm at somebody's house, and the hostess walks through where I'm seeing the Buddha, should I yell at her and say, hey, you bumped into the Buddha, you know, walk around, or something? Like, I mean, that's psychosis, right? Like, that would be. That's what psychotic people do, right? Like, there's a flexibility of mind, right? Like, I'm visualizing the Buddha, and actually, according to Buddhism, if you visualize the Buddha's there, right? In other words, the Buddha's everywhere. In some sense, the Buddha's omnipresent and omnipotent, and not omnipotent, omnipresent and omniscient. So if I visualize the Buddha, I can say, well, yeah, it'd be valid to say if I'm visualizing the Buddha's there because actually the Buddha's mind pervades everything, not the Buddha's form body, right? So why shouldn't I tell the lady to walk around? I'm visualizing the Buddha there, and I believe that the Buddha's there because the Buddha's mind is omnipresent. So why shouldn't I tell that lady to move, like because she's standing on the Buddha's robe or something? Why is that not valid to tell her that?
Anywhere she'd be walking, we should be bumping into her.
Right, it's a problem. Yeah, then there'd be a problem, right?
Yeah.
That's a good point. Good way to put it. Yeah, and also, yeah, right. And so I could move the Buddha then or something, you know, whatever. It doesn't matter, right? You see, I'm just trying to get at this feeling of flexibility. So the idea here, right, in part, is that if you see if you see the teacher as the Buddha, it's like that in a way, right? Like, in other words, I'm visualizing the Buddha there because I want to make offerings, right? You see the feeling? In other words, like, it's this feeling of like wherever you visualize them, then they're there in some sense. You know, can you debate, you know, is this person the Buddha or not? Well, that's actually not a subject. That's actually, you know, the Buddhism says everything's up for debate, right? But in a sense, that's not a meaningful subject to debate because it's a mental training. So does that make sense? Whereas if I say I'm training my mind to see things in that way because it's useful, well, I'm not trying to develop a valid cognition, so you can't really debate that in that sense. But now I want to go through and so the next stage is actually how do you meditate, and this will also get to the feeling and also some of the other benefits of why you would do this, because I didn't get to all the benefits yet. But actually, there are two different contemplations that you go through to develop, and it's two different qualities actually. Faith, which is what I've already talked about. Faith in the sense of like the iPad, you know, like that. But now it's towards your teacher, right? And then the second one is respect, remembering the kindness. So those are two different states of mind, right? Because, you know, faith is seeing the good qualities, and then respect means, in Buddhism, in this particular contemplation, it means remembering the other's kindness and feeling both connected and grateful to them. And okay, so let's go through that actually. Yeah. So actually, what I want to go through is how you would actually meditate on that, and then we're gonna, from that, I think it will imply why you do it. Does that make sense? So I'm reversing the order slightly. So how you would meditate, right? Actually, the traditional way, right? You would have your visual, you know, like if you're doing Lam Rim meditation, right? Stages of the path meditation, you would visualize either the Buddha in front or on the crown of your head, or Lama Tsongkhapa on the crown, you know, something like that, right? So in this particular meditation, right, actually you actually I want to share just a brief side story about this meditation. Jan Willis, who was actually one of my first two teachers. Actually, she's my guru. She was a professor at Wesleyan University when I was undergrad. She's still there. She's a professor. She was very kind to me. And she told this story. She said one time she was one of the first students of Lama Yeshe and Lama Zopa. And actually at the center she told this story. She said Lama Yeshe, she really liked Lama Yeshe, and then he said, and Lama Zopa, she was quite young then. I guess he's around her age. And so anyway, Lama Yeshe said, go hang out with Zopa. So she goes and hangs out with Zopa. And she liked Lama Yeshe, I guess, at that time. They were, you know, she was young and just there, and she really wanted to be around Lama Yeshe, but he said, go hang out with Zopa. So she goes over to Lama Zopa, and Lama Zopa, I guess Lama Zopa probably wasn't as fun because he was always saying like this. He was a very skinny, you know, if you see the pictures of him when he was quite young, he was very skinny and he was always sitting like this, you know. And so she's like, you know, Lama Yeshe would be joking around or something, I think, so she was kind of joking that, you know, it's like, oh, that's, you know, I don't know, not as fun. And so she goes over and sits down with Lama Zopa, and Lama Zopa's sitting like this, and she says, hi, Lama Yeshe told me to hang out with you or something. And Lama Zopa starts going, she said Lama Zopa was sitting like this with a very serious face, and he would say something like, Geshe Rab, definitely a Buddha. Absolutely a Buddha. And he said, Sri Jang Rinpoche, totally enlightened. Absolutely. And he's going through a list, and she's like, okay, you know, so, trying to talk, you know, so it's like, you know, Geshe so and so, total incredible qualities, total Buddha, you know, and then she's, oh wow, and like maybe some of them she knew, some she didn't, I don't know, but, okay, you know, and then Lama's always doing this meditation we're about to do, right? So he's like, he was just, you know, he said Lama Yeshe sent her over, okay, I'll tell you, you know, like what else is there to talk about? This is what I'm meditating on. He was doing the meditation we're describing, right? And I think she was like, eventually trying to change the topic. He was meditating on Lam Rim all the time, right? On the stages of the path all the time. But so in this particular meditation, so let's say you're visual, I'm just going to give an example, because you could do the Buddha in front or on your crown. So if you had the Buddha on your crown, right? So then from the Buddha, you'd have like, they describe it like light rays that are like very thin, like spider webs. Like, you know, the thickness of a spider web. That these little light rays shoot out from the Buddha's heart. And then in front of you, in their ordinary forms, are all your teachers. Right? So they're all there. And Khenpo Rinpoche said, as part of the instruction, you don't leave any of your teachers out. If you do, it creates an obstacle to your practice. Right? So you visualize all your teachers there. And then you go through these contemplations, right? So I'm going to, actually, so this is an important point too, actually, that all the teachers say, actually, is that you also, like, we as ordinary people, there can be a tendency to want to, and it can be a mistaken tendency I want to mention, which is like, one Geshe who I was a student of, one of my teachers said, um, he said don't make the mistake of thinking like that you have big teachers and little teachers, or something like that. He said when you visualize them, they're all the contemplation is they're all the Buddha. So like he said, it would be a mistake to think, oh, the Dalai Lama is a Buddha, but like for me, right? If I'm visualizing the Dalai Lama's there, right? He's one of my teachers, and then also I'm going to pick Jan Willis as an example, right? Who's a professor, right? So if I thought, well, the Dalai Lama's the Dalai Lama, and she's a professor, so he's more important, and that would be a mistake. Does that make sense? Like from my point of view, in other words, in contemplation, you view them as all the same. Does that make sense? Kind of? That's the mental training here. And so then, and now here's like, I guess, we're getting, even again, I'm sort of pausing a lot, but I think it's an important point, is this is a psychological thing. So, actually with anybody, I just want to point out, this is true with any creature. It's not just humans even, right? If you focus on any creature's, actually, check for you. If you focus on any creature's bad qualities, right, what starts to happen? Like if you start thinking of their faults, right? Like if you start thinking, you know, they're impatient, I don't like this thing about their nose, and their ear is ugly, and like they're, you know, and one time they said this to me and I didn't like it, another time they said that to me and I didn't like it, one time they sneezed too loud in my ear, you know, something like, if you start going like that, right, eventually you're going to find them annoying, right? Whereas the appearance that's going to come to your mind is one of aversion, actually, right, like wishing you could get away from them. And if you do it long enough, eventually you'll even feel angry at them, actually. Whereas with any sentient creature, if you start thinking about their good qualities, what happens? You start feeling closer to them, right? And you start, they take on the aspect of something positive to your mind. Does that make sense? Actually, that's the difference. You know, like when going back to the Shakespeare example, right? Like, I mean, you know, that's how does somebody, you know, like this is common, right? How can it be that sometimes we're madly in love with somebody and then we hate them, right? Which happens all the time, right, in our world, right? It's just the aspect of them that comes to our mind, right? Like in other words, when you're madly in love with a person, the good aspect, you know, all their strengths and positive attributes are coming to your mind. Then when you hate them, all their negative attributes, they haven't changed. They're the same, right? It was just you were exaggerating one direction and exaggerating the other. And so you have like huge attachment, you know, at first you never want to be part of them, then you want to murder them. And, like that's just your mind, right? Exaggerating one direction or the other. So here what we're trying to do actually is develop a sense of, well, train our mind, so we're focusing on the positive aspects. That's the important point. So you start, right? So like, so if I'll pick an example, right? So you start, like, I'll pick Lama Zopa Rinpoche because we're at the Guyas Maja Center, Lama Zopa. So if I think of Lama Zopa, right? So then I would first training is seeing the teacher's good qualities, right? And so that's not difficult, actually, right? So if I start thinking of Lama Zopa Rinpoche, right? Actually, like he has, you know, whether you think of his compassion for others, right? You know, it's easy with him, right? Because you can go through all these lists. I mean, it's quite simple because, like, for example, you know, he started leprosy projects. He started schools. He started so many, you know, Dharma centers and shares Dharma with people all over the earth. And, you know, and he takes on so much hardship to help others, right? Like, in other words, he was quite happy living in Nepal, and you know, he had a quite nice situation there. But then, you know, he travels everywhere. And every time somebody gives him something, he gives it away. He doesn't keep anything. He doesn't, you know, he's not, like, it's very clear. So you can actually, if you start to contemplate, right, and then also like his qualities of learning, right. I mean, he's, you know, he's had a stroke and he's in his 60s and still he goes all over he'll like travel halfway around the world to study some teaching with one of his teachers and so on. You know, and his quality, you know, and the quality of being utterly tireless in helping others, right. Like, he won't sleep for 3 or 4 days because if people are, you know, wanting things from him, then he just keeps going, right? And for 3 or 4 days in a row, he doesn't sleep because he's helping other people. And, you know, he does so many projects, right? Hospices, and, you know, so like if you contemplate like that, it's not difficult, right? To think, wow, quality, like, you know, he does so many things, and he composes books about compassion, and books about training the mind, and books about stages of the path, and, you know, and he's so patient both with two kinds of patients actually. One is when people mistreat him, actually he's great, like I gave that example, but he's always like that. But then also the patience, he has this incredible patience of taking on difficult tasks. So like for example, really difficult students come along that most teachers wouldn't want. He wants to be there, he's happy to help them. And then also with these projects, right? Like because every project, like for us, if we take on one project, there's so much annoyance, right? Like there's so many difficult things. Like you take on something, right, and then there's all these problems that come, right? And he doesn't stop taking on more, and he just like doesn't worry. And the problems don't bother him, and so you can see that. And you go, wow, I couldn't. For me, it gets so stressful just doing one, and then he takes on so many projects like that, right? So if you think like that, then you start to develop some feeling of appreciation. Right? And then I'll go through a few more. Then also there's a teaching that says that the Buddha, right, and Vajradhara, right, Buddha Vajradhara, it's a quote from one of the aspects of the Buddha, promised that he would always manifest in a form to benefit beings, and in the degenerate times now he would come to benefit others. So then, if I'm contemplating, I would say, well, if the Buddha's around now, if it's not Lama Zopa, who is it actually, right? Because he's doing the work of the Buddha actually, right? Or he's all the teachings of the Buddha he's explaining, in Buddhist. Whether it's art, whether it's the mental trainings, or whether it's art forms, or whether it's like music or visual arts, or the formal teachings or meditation, he's helping all those. Like all those things he's sharing with others. So if I think, if the Buddha's manifest, and if you think of like the Buddha promised to manifest in difficult times as an ordinary person, right? So then you think, well, if the Buddha is manifesting, how would it be other than as him? Because he's doing exactly what the Buddha would be doing, so that's logical. And that and actually the Buddha said, during difficult times, he said for ordinary people I'll manifest as an ordinary person. He said for really bad people I'll even manifest as a bad person to try to make them better, and so on. And so you could say, well, of all the different manifestations, he's about as good as one could hope for. Actually, couldn't really hope for a more pure. He's a monk. He's very pure. He doesn't do anything. Or he's like. Doesn't do anything bad, actually, only helps others. And also the nature of Buddhas and Bodhisattvas is to help others, right? And whereas the Buddha, whereas why a Buddha trains to become enlightened is to benefit others. Well, and so in terms of Dharma, like who's benefiting others, like Lama Zopa is for sure benefiting others. He teaches emptiness so precisely for hours and hours and hours in these like difficult subjects, and he teaches them over and over. So that makes sense, right? In other words, if the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas are working for others, then they work like that. But then, now comes, I think, an interesting part that I want to emphasize a little bit. So let's say you're training like that, right? So if I start thinking like that, then I would think, wow, actually, it's not that difficult, right? If I'm thinking of Lama Zopa Rinpoche, say, actually, if Buddhas exist and they manifest to benefit others, like, they would for sure manifest like Lama Zopa. So it's quite clear, right? In other words, that he's the Buddha manifesting to benefit others like me. But then, and actually the Panchen Lama, I like this, the Panchen Lama, when he wrote a text on this, actually the Easy Path that Kinshumshi taught, he says, then raise qualms to yourself, because they're going to be there somewhere in the back of your mind. So like, so then you're supposed to say something like this, well wait a sec, like, it's like when people say, the Dalai Lama wears glasses. That's like typical, like, right? So you can say, but wait a second, like, Lama Zopa, let's see, so okay, but Lama Zopa, first of all, he doesn't shoot, like, in some sutras, the Buddhas shoot out light rays everywhere. I never saw Lama Zopa shoot out light rays. Why? Maybe he's not a Buddha. You're supposed to actually ask these questions, right? Also, he had a stroke, right? Buddhists don't have, he has high blood pressure. Buddhists don't have high blood pressure. How can he be Buddha, right? So you're supposed to, so you intentionally do that, right? You raise the qualm, right? And then what, actually, right? So now you're debating with yourself, because you're actually trying to work with your own mind, right? You get this point, it's a psychological exercise for you, right? You're doing all this silently. So then what do you do, actually? So you say, okay, well, so he had a stroke, right? And he has high blood pressure. How could he be Buddha? Shakyamuni Buddha didn't have high blood pressure. So deities in Pure Lands made of light don't have high blood pressure. How could he be a Buddha? Right? So you're supposed to contemplate like that, right? So you're supposed to raise a question. And actually what Lama Zopa Rinpoche says, he taught us, but there are different ways to contemplate. I guess what I'm getting is there are different contemplations of that. But actually, the most useful one, I think, for me personally, the most useful one is this. There are two actually though. So one is, actually one that they call it, you can't be sure of your appearances. So actually, I'll go through that one first. That's not the most useful one to me personally, but I'll just share it because it's good. It's actually a good contemplation stuff. It's like this. It's to say, first of all, well actually, no, do this one. Actually, so this is using traditional Buddhist examples. So you say this, actually Asanga, right? The great Bodhisattva Asanga, who wrote five of the greatest treatises, and he was an abbot of Nalanda monastery, and saw Maitreya directly, right? But they say when he first saw Maitreya directly, it was in the form of a sick dog. And that, remember there's a famous story where he did 12 years of retreat, he never saw Maitreya, then finally he gave up the retreat and went out and he saw a dog dying, right? And then he went and he cut off part of its leg and he tried to save the maggots from the dog, and he went down to lick the maggots off because he didn't want to hurt them, and then his face hit the earth because the dog wasn't there anymore, and he looked up and he saw Maitreya, right? And he said to Maitreya, I think it's very human of him, he said to Maitreya, where were you all those 12 years? You know, I spent all, and actually, I usually don't mention this part, I thought it was funny. Maitreya says, I was right there in the cave with you all 12 years, you know, you didn't have the merit to see me. And Asanga, again being very human, says, I'm not sure I believe you. And then he says to Asanga, remember last week when you spit, like, you know, a big, you know, that guy? He goes, look at me. He goes, look at my robe. He says, there's a stain from your big lookie or whatever. And then Asanga goes, okay, I guess you were there. You do I did that big, you know, kind of spit, I guess you were there. So, you know, it's very, these meetings between bodhisattvas and meditators are never, like, again, they're not like the Western stories. They always have that quality of earthiness. You know, so you made a big spit, you landed right on me. No, he says, I don't blame you, you couldn't see me, but don't do it again. No, I just added that. But the point is, so you say, okay, Asanga was an Arya Bodhisattva, but he was only capable of seeing a dog, actually, right? And then you say, there are many contemplations like Naropa, actually, right? After he was abbot, again, he was much higher than us. Naropa, Naropa, right? He had been abbot, or not abbot, he had been one of the, like a dean at Nalanda Monastery. He was a great scholar. And then, right, he had that vision of, I was like, the woman with 37 ugly features came along. Right? And they actually list, if you read the story of Naropa's life, it's hilarious. They list all 37. So she had a big boil, and she had like a hunchback, or all these like different. So they list all 37 ugly features. You know, in that famous story where she said to him, he was outside reading, right, like a scholar should be, and she said, do you understand the words, or do you understand the meaning? And Naropa says, you know, he's like, you know, like you asked the dean of Harvard that, right? He says, well, I understand, of course I understand the words. And she starts leaping around, and he's looking at her, like, and he says, what are you doing? And she says, I'm so happy, you know, you told the truth, you know, you do understand the words. And he said, well, I also understand the meaning. And then she starts going, like beating her head and throwing dirt at her, and he goes like, what are you doing? And she said, now you lied, and you're a monk. Monks aren't supposed to lie, why'd you lie? He says, what do you mean? He says, you don't understand the meaning at all. And he kind of like, it hit him in some way. He was like, I don't, in other words, he realized that maybe intellectually he understood the meaning, but he hadn't realized the meaning. And she knew that about him, and he got that she knew that about him, and everybody else thought he was a great scholar. And there came this moment between them, right, where he says, you're right. You know, he actually had the humility to say, you know, kind of, you know, I get it intellectually, but actually in my heart I don't. And he said, how'd you know? Or something like that. Who does? And she says, my brother Talopa knows the meaning. You know, to the depths of his bones, kind of thing, right? And so Naropa gave up his, what's it called? You know, gave up his deanship or something, and hit the road looking for Talopa. And they say that he was like wandering around going to everybody, do you know where Talopa is? Do you know, I'm looking for Talopa. Do you know where he is? So he comes across this guy who's like eating live fish, right? Some guy like a crazy person eating live fish beside the river. He says, by any chance, do you know where Talopa is? And the guy said, and like the robot's clearly looking kind of grossed out, right? And then the guy kind of says to him, I forget the exact words, but something like, you know, as long as you discriminate between, you know, kind of looking at his facial expression, as long as you discriminate between people with that kind of facial expression, you're never going to find Talopa. And then the guy kind of disappears into a ball of light and shoots into the sky or something. And he goes, oh damn, that was Talopa. And every time he sees Talopa, for the first few times, Talopa manifests doing something, intentionally manifests doing something gross like that. And Talopa, being this kind of very pure, upright guy, can't help it, get kind of grossed out. And then Talopa kind of, again, does some joke on him. But so you think, well, Naropa, who is much higher than me, he could only see some guy eating live fish. Like, what do I know? Kind of like, so you go through, there are many historical examples, and then there's, even Milarepa, right? You guys some of you are reading the life of Milarepa, right? And when he first comes across Marpa, he just sees some farmer, right? There is he shows up, right? And he says, oh, I heard Marpa lives in this valley, and he goes to the valley, and he sees some guy drinking beer and farming, right? And he goes up to the guy and he says, do you know where Marpa is? And the guy goes, want a beer? And auspiciously, Milarepa says yes and drinks the whole beer. He hadn't yet taken vows not to drink alcohol. And Naropa downs the beer, and then Marpa he doesn't know it's Marpa, right? He just thinks it's some beer drinking farmer. And the guy says, I think he's over in that house, I'm going over there anyway, or something like that, and he goes over there, and anyway, so Marpa goes in the back door, Milarepa comes in the front door, and then he walks into the room, yes, and they say, oh yeah, Marpa's in here, and he walks in and he sees the farmer, sitting on the throat or something, right? So the point is like, if even you contemplate, if even beings like, the great Bodhisattva Asanga, and the great master Naropa, and Milarepa, and you can go through, there are many other examples like that. Right? There's an example also of Patrul Rinpoche, who was a great Nyingma master, who, he showed up, he was supposed to give a teaching at this big monastery, and so they were expecting him, like the way Lama Zopa arrives, with a whole entourage of people. They didn't know him though yet. It was his first time teaching there. But he arrived alone. He escaped from his group and he arrived alone. And he showed up and he said, hey, what's going on? And they said, hi. He said, you guys need any help with anything? And he happened to bump into some young monk, and the monk goes, I think they need help in the kitchen. So he goes in the kitchen and he starts cooking, helping out. He was not cooking, but being the assistant cook, just chopping, cleaning the things. And he stayed there for a few days, being dishwasher, right? And then his entourage arrives later, some other people who knew him, and the abbots all come out and they're all bowing, like the abbot of the monastery is out bowing to this entourage, right? And then the entourage is looking at the abbot and going, where's Patrul Rinpoche? And the abbot goes, I don't know, where's Patrul Rinpoche? He said, I thought you were Patrul Rinpoche. And they're like, no, where is, I'm his assistant. He came ahead. He didn't come ahead, we haven't seen him. Oh, what happened? They're all like, we better send out a search party, right? So they're going in, they're trying to organize a search party, and then of course the assistant goes, well, he's right over there, in the kitchen. What's he doing there? And then the abbot's all turns, all embarrassed. What? And he said, I came and asked if anybody needed help, and they said that was where you needed help, was in the kitchen. So help it out. They said, please stop helping in the kitchen and come teach. So the point is, we can't judge, right? In other words, you can't, you use these examples to say, I can't. In other words, and that how things appear to us depends on our karma. So that's one way of viewing it. But I think there's another, for me, I think there's another more useful even way than that, which is this, is to think also that, this one might seem hard at the beginning, but actually if you contemplate it deeply, then it actually has quite, I think it has great meaning. Is actually to think that, to relate to me personally, then a teacher has to take on the aspect of false, actually. That actually there's no way that I would get much benefit if the teacher doesn't take on the aspect of false. And actually this one at first could seem, when I first heard it, I didn't relate too well. But actually if you contemplate it deeply, it has deep meaning. And the reason is this, if you actually contemplate it experientially, right, you think, so if I'm meditating, I think, well, I have so many faults, actually, right? That actually a teacher who doesn't overcome any faults, isn't much of an example for me. Right? They may be quite wonderful, but actually, what's there to say it? I can't relate too much to them. And in terms of that aspect, and I'll go back to that analogy I gave earlier of there was the fact in the biography I read when I was 10 years old of Bill Bradley where he wanted to go in and then he thought, oh, but somebody else is still practicing, I'll keep trying, right? but he had, you know, like in other words, he had some aspect of laziness, like a normal person, but then he overcame it, right? I mean, that's part of what was inspiring, right? But if he had just said, you know, well, I naturally enjoyed practicing for 16 hours a day and doing my homework and only sleeping for 4 hours, and, you know, even when I was a teenager, that's what was fun to me, I would have been like, this guy's just a weirdo or something, you know, like, I wouldn't have related, right? In other words, the fact that it was a struggle and that he overcame it is what made it, is part of what made it inspiring, right? And so, I'll give one other example of this, like, you know, actually, like if I do that meditation, right, of all the teachers there, right, then like it's quite easy, for example, to see the Dalai Lama, right? You look at the Dalai Lama and, you know, it's quite easy to see him as enlightened. But actually, if you get into the contemplation, right, then you start, like actually, there's a, in the respect part, right, the next part, there's a, meditations on respect, like I said, remembering the kindness, right? And one of the ways you remember the kindness is you say, my teacher is more kind to me than all the Buddhas. And actually even kinder than Shakyamuni Buddha. And for me, that's true, right? Because I never met Shakyamuni Buddha, and he's gone, but Kensho Rinpoche's here, right? So Kensho Rinpoche is much more helpful to me personally than Shakyamuni Buddha was, because I never met him, and so, so from my perspective, it's not that they're different in necessarily in internal quality, but for me, it's much more useful. But I'm going to give an example now, just because to get to this point here. Like, I'll give you an example of my first teacher. Actually, even before I met Jan Willis, I had another professor, who nobody's ever heard of. His name was Jim. And he, like, so if I contemplate on him, right? And now on the one hand, first of all, he wore glasses, so he didn't have some kind of X-ray vision. You know, there wasn't, and he was like a professor, right? And sometimes he even gave the aspect of being a bit impatient with students. So, you know, he was that kind of, he was like a little, a few times he made students cry. He was that kind of professor, you know, like where he could be like, what? You know, kind of like, you know, he was a very brilliant person, but kind of, you know, sometimes brilliant professors who can be a little, I don't know what the word is, like, teach in a certain way where, you know, a very sensitive student might go, oh, I feel so stupid. Sorry. Like, he was that kind of person, right? So I could think of him, right? And I could think, well, you know, actually he didn't show the aspect of perfection, right? Whereas he could seem a bit gruff, and he was even a few times he kind of was, you know, not in a bad way, but he was a little gruff to me a few times and stuff like that. But if I contemplate it, actually, right, like, at that time, right, actually at that point, if I think of who I was then, I had no interest in the Dalai Lama, right? I never heard of him. And even Lama Zopa, like, if somebody had said Lama Zopa's going to town, I wouldn't have gone, I don't think. I wouldn't know what they were talking about, actually, right? So I needed somebody who, actually, and it was, if I think back, right, like, first of all, I needed somebody who was in the role of professor, right, because I was a student, but also somebody who was a little demanding and pushy, and even he got me to meditate, actually, you know, because he was kind of like, start with say it, he was like, I hated getting up early, he was like, if you want to meditate, you have to get up at 6 a.m. and be there, and I don't care, you know, he was like, he kind of had this attitude like that. And I remember I was like, and then I thought, what the hell am I doing? I'm getting up at 6 a.m. Like, I'm a lazy person in the morning. And I was like, okay, I'm doing it. And I think back, and if I think back, I think, like, even his taking on the aspect of being gruff was actually incredibly helpful to me. Does that make sense? Like, and that, if it had, you know, and if he had seemed like incredibly sort of serene, you know, I don't think I would have been as engaged, actually. I mean, it got me emotionally engaged in Buddhism, that he was challenging. Does that make sense? And that he was intellectually challenging was very helpful to me at the time. And so, actually, like, if I think about it, he was, not just Lama Zopa, but he was kinder to me than Shakyamuni Buddha, actually, right? Because Shakyamuni Buddha, I never would have met Shakyamuni Buddha if it weren't for him, actually. He was the person who introduced me to Shakyamuni Buddha. And also, the fact of his seeming complicated was helpful to me at the time. Does that make sense? And was actually more inspiring. And even the fact that he was provocative and made me disagree with him was helpful, right? Because also I have this, like, I would have had the tendency, I don't know what there is, you know, if he had seemed perfect or something, to me, I think it wouldn't have been very interesting at that time. But the fact that he was provocative and I disagreed with him and I would try to outsmart him and he would always win, you know, because he was smarter than me and the professor, like, was good for me. You know, it also was humbling, but inspiring and engaging. And actually, like, it was unbelievably helpful, right? And I'll give another example. Like, another example for me was Riba Rinpoche, when he, you know, came to the DC area and got diagnosed with cancer, right? Like, that was the most helpful thing that ever happened in my life, I think, in some ways, was the fact that, you know, and so if he had never manifested with cancer, I never would have gotten as close to him. Does that make sense? Like, so, like, the fact that he had, and like also, so we say this, like, it allowed me to feel useful to him, and therefore feel more intimate with him, and therefore develop a much closer relationship and watch him in the context of difficult things. And so there came a point where I felt unbelievably grateful that he would be here around me while he had cancer. You know, like, actually, it couldn't have been more kind, because, as I always say, that, like, when I had seen him just on a throne before, you know, like, the first time I met him, I didn't know him, right? I went to Land of Medicine Buddha, he was on the throne, I was in the back row somewhere, I just thought, oh, these teachings are cool, right? But I learned so much more by relating to him when he had cancer than I did when he was on the throne, right? So in terms of the kindness to me, actually from an experiential perspective, it was so kind that he had cancer. Does that make sense in a way? Like, I'm just trying to give away, this is how you contemplate this point, right? So that actually you start to think, if the teachers didn't manifest as ordinary with problems, then it wouldn't benefit me that much, because I'm not at that level, right? Actually, Arya Bodhisattvas who have seen everything regularly, they can go to Pure Lands and see Buddhas, and they can like have that, and they can benefit from that. Like, what's the way to say it? I can't relate, right? Like, in other words, you contemplate it, right? You say, I can't relate to that. Actually, like that's whereas I need somebody who is, you know, who's overcoming something, and who's, you know, or who's doing like kind of like what I could do, but 3 or 4 steps ahead. You know, so that, like, that's what I need for me to have benefit. Does that make sense, kind of? So you contemplate like that until, right? So you keep contemplating these things, right? So the Buddha. So you go through those points, right? The Buddhas manifest, right? How would they manifest? But as somebody, you know, and you even think, right? The supreme activity of a Buddha is teaching, right? Is explaining the meaning of the Dharma, right? So, so then particularly, right, the person who explains the Dharma to me, right, in a way that I understand it, then they're performing the activity of the Buddha, actually, for me. Does that make sense? That's part of the contemplation there. And if the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, you know, continue to manifest, then that's how they would manifest this. Whoever explains teaching so that I can understand them, really, in my own experience, right? And then that the teacher, right, and then you go through the kindness, right? That the teacher is kinder than the Buddhas, and kinder even than Shakyamuni Buddha, for me, right? Because there are 35 Buddhas of prostration, right? But actually, like, they're, you know, who were very kind. But for me, if Lama Zopa had introduced me to them, I wouldn't know who those were. I wouldn't have any relevance to it, right? And if he hadn't explained to me how Lama Tsongkhapa did that practice, and he did that practice, and everybody did that practice, and the lineage teachers of the Gelugpa tradition did it, you know, then you start to get some inspiration. Right? And then you contemplate how that who gives me the not just who gives me knowledge, but who gives me inspiration is them, right? It's these people I'm visualizing here. They're the ones who actually inspire me, right, in this way, and bless my mind stream. That's meaning blessing, right? That they inspire me. Anyway, so you keep contemplating, and then you come to the point that Lama Zopa came to, right, with Jan Willis, that they, definitely this person's a Buddha. Definitely, you know, in other words, like, where you feel like that, right? That's your experience. What's the way to say it? Again, I want to be clear on this, right? It's not that you feel it in the way that you would then go out and say to somebody else, like, what? You don't know that the Dalai Lama is a Buddha? You're wrong and I'm right. Like, if you approach it that way, then you've gotten off track. Does that make sense? Like, it's not that you want to come to that conclusion in like some fundamentalist way that you want to then go to people's doorsteps and tell them, you know, you should understand that Lama Zopa is a Buddha, or that professor from, you know, undergraduates. That's not the point, right? The point is you should come to an inner feeling that, like, it benefits me, and I understand, and I can relate to them as a Buddha. Does that make sense? And the reason for that, now I just want to get into this, like, because what does that do for you, actually? Why would you go through the effort? So I want to say a little more about that, and then we'll have a discussion thing. I think the reason that you want to do that is manifold, actually, and I think it's very subtle. I want to say this, like, all the lineage masters, right? Like, if you look at like Milarepa, and there's a great Gelugpa one, Gyawa and Sapa, who achieved enlightenment in one lifetime. Actually, and there are others like that. They all say the same thing, which is, when people ask them, how did you achieve enlightenment in one lifetime? They said, because I saw my teacher as the Buddha. That was always their answer, right? So this particular training is especially, it's actually in many ways a very advanced training. But there are reasons for it, so I just want to share what they are, because I think it's an important point, is this. if you can accomplish this kind of training, actually, right, then you'll believe, because I guess I'm going to say this, like, it doesn't, the point is not to benefit the teacher, actually, right? And actually, you never have to tell it, you never have to tell your teacher even that you think that. It doesn't matter, actually, it's irrelevant, that's not what's important. What's important is this, is if you can develop that kind of view and that kind of experience, right, of seeing them that way, a few things happen. One is, then you'll come to believe that you can become a Buddha. That's actually what's important in part, right? Like, in other words, if you can view that person as a Buddha, then you'll come to view yourself as capable of becoming a Buddha. Also, if you can relate to them in that way, right, you start to believe that enlightenment is possible. Does that make sense? Like, otherwise it seems like some science fiction fantasy or something. And I'll be honest, from my experience, like, although it's quite easy to think of the Dalai Lama as the Buddha, for me, right? Like, if I think of the Dalai Lama, it's quite easy to think of him as the Buddha. But actually, like, for me personally, it's like, it's inspiring, but it doesn't relate to me personally that well, because he seems so different from me. He was like the 14th Dalai Lama, and he seemed so obviously, like, sorry to say it, like, you watch his activity, I think he doesn't seem very similar to me, unfortunately for me. But if you think of, like, when I think of somebody like who was, I'll think of a teacher who was an ordinary monk, right, who became something quite special. And then for me, that's easier to get inspiration, because I think, wow, like, that person studied really hard. Dalai Lama, I don't know, when you read his life story, it's like he read something and he understood it the first time, right, and he memorized it. So he would read a teaching and, like, immediately he memorized the entire book and he understood the meaning of it. And that's inspiring in one way, but it wasn't really my experience. Like, the first time I read a book, I didn't memorize it and understand all the meanings deeply. But if you think of, when I think of, like, some of my teachers who were ordinary, like, I'm just giving an example, right? This teacher was an ordinary monk. He studied very hard. He stayed up late at night. He was, like, working hard at it. He rose up, through both, first intellectually and then through experience, and then to retreat, and then achieved some kind of realizations, and then kept going. And then, like, I would look and say, wow, he practiced Tantra, and he, realized the generation stage, realized the completion, and he actually did all that in one lifetime through hard work and through his own effort. Then I feel much more like, wow, he did that, I can do that then. It's possible, it's not impossible. Does that make sense? So you start to develop, there are many benefits. One of them is you start to feel that way. Does that make sense? Then another benefit is that, again, at the beginning, if you think, oh, there are Buddhas everywhere and they pervade all of space, and, there could be a Buddha here, honestly, it seems a little, at the beginning, like a little bit, it seems about as relevant, somebody says, oh, there's string theory, right, that, this table is made up of vibrating energy that can be conceptualized as strings. That's, like, interesting, but that's cool. Okay, what's next? Like, like, it doesn't really relate to any experience. It's a bit like that. But if you start to relate to your teachers like this on a day-to-day level, and then you start to visualize them there, right, and think of them all the time or often, then all the Buddhas start to seem relevant experientially to you. Does that make sense? So you start to develop a relationship to the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas. And then there's another benefit that's really quite an important one, which is this whole idea of field of merit. Right? They call it, like, the field of, when we visualize, like, in the puja, right, in a meditation, we say, oh, you visualize the merit field. Like, for example, if you visualize Shakyamuni Buddha there in front of you, he's a merit field. And the point is this, of that, is a merit field just means somebody you can create good karma in relation to. And so they often say there are two merit fields. One is suffering sentient beings, right? You develop good karma in relation to them through compassion. Right? But then the other merit field, the most powerful one actually, is your teacher, right? The other one. Because if the teacher represents all the Buddhas, right? Then, so the idea is this. Actually, Nagarjuna said. Actually, the great master Nagarjuna. He said, I've given up offering to anyone else. I always offer to my guru. What he meant was not that he didn't help other people, but that he would all the time think of his guru everywhere. Right? Like, in other words, that became his practice. So if he was making offerings to a stupa, that stupa was his guru. Right? If he was making offerings, and through that, I guess what the way is, like, there are a few things. Like, because actually you have to understand karma, right? That karma is all about your mind, right? In other words, like if I go like this, is that good karma? Well, it depends, right? If I'm going like this because I met a Japanese business person and I want to impress them and I know about their culture, so they'll give me some money. That's not good karma. That's, whatever. It's making a gesture. It's the same as any other business, right? But if somebody goes like this to the Buddha because it's their culture, like they're Japanese or they're Tibetan, is that good karma? I'm not sure. Actually. I guess it is maybe a little bit, but not much, right? And then if I go like this because I respect the Buddha, right? Let's say I see a statue of the Buddha and I go like this because I respect the Buddha, then there's some good karma there, right? But actually, like, karma is determined by your mind, right? So the difference is, actually, if I go like this because I see a Buddha statue and I respect the Buddha, right? Then I create a little bit of good karma in relation to that, my mental image of the Buddha, actually. Right? You can't create good karma in relation to the atoms of the statue in particular, right? They're just atoms of metal, let's say. Right? But it's because I have the thought of the Buddha that I'm developing a little bit, right? But then if I've trained my mind like this, right? And if I think, so I see Khensa Rinpoche, let's say, right? And I think Khensa Rinpoche is not really Khensa Rinpoche. In other words, that's a label, right? I mean he's labeled Khensa Rinpoche, that's correct labeling. But actually, he's the embodiment of the Dharmakaya of all the Buddhas, right? The mind of all the Buddhas, right? And so in some sense, all the Buddhas are him, and he's all the Buddhas. Because his mind and all the Buddha's mind, that's what I'm meditating on, right? That his mind and all the Buddha's mind are the same, and I go like this, right? Then actually I'm just doing that prostration to all the Buddhas that exist or ever have existed. Right? So you see the difference. In other words, it's a way of, it all depends on your mind, so by training your mind in this way, you create more good karma, or more merit, or something like that. Anyway, I think we should stop there. What I want to do is for like 15, 20 minutes, I want people, my idea is this, with this subject, I think people should have qualms. Actually, you know that word qualm or concerns or something like that. And actually, it's not just me, it's not just me who thinks that. The Panchen Lama said that, right? Whereas he says you should have qualms, actually, right? When you're contemplating like this. And you should face those qualms honestly. So what I want to do is ask you guys to break up into groups and raise your qualms, right? So raise your qualms to think your teacher is the Buddha. So what concerns do you have about that? Why would that seem, and again, when we're just doing mindfulness of breathing, right, and it's obvious that that's beneficial to your health and it's calming, that's not, there's no reason to have qualms at all, right? This, you should have qualms, I think, personally. So what I want to do is actually break up into groups of like 3, maybe, around 3 or 4, and raise your qualms, and then let's talk about them for a few minutes, and then I want to talk about them more next time. So really try to be, and I guess I want to encourage you, be honest, in other words, if the Panchen Lama, who was the teacher of the 5th Dalai Lama, if he can raise qualms, then you can certainly, he was a monk and a Lama and a Tibetan, and we're Western, non-monastics. So if he had qualms, we should certainly have qualms. So if you say, I don't have any qualms, I think my teacher's the Buddha, and it's no problem, and all my teachers the Buddha, and that's easy, then you're not, if the Panchen Lama could raise concerns about that, if you're saying it oh no, that's simple, then you're not being honest with yourself. So do raise qualms, okay? But go ahead and break up into groups of 3 or 4, and people had some. What were concerns and qualms that people had?
My big concern, or my big question was, how do you know where to draw that line in terms of questioning your teacher, or coming up with your own idea, contrary, like you were saying, that one monk or whatever came up, had different ideas from his teacher, how, because there's one extreme you can go to that was kind of that fanatic, whatever you call it, extremism or whatever. And then on the other end, you can get to the point where you're questioning things because maybe you're not comfortable with that, or maybe you don't see the merit in it. But then again, you obviously don't know what's right, because that's why you need a teacher in the first place, because you're suffering and you don't know how to get out of it, obviously, or you wouldn't need a teacher. And so, so it's well, how do you know where to draw that line? And also, I think a lot of it has to do with in terms of where I see it, and I notice with other people, is how do you draw that line in terms of, especially with Tibetan Buddhism, what some stuff you think well, maybe that's just Tibetan culture, maybe that's not, maybe that's not essential for the thing, and maybe that's whatever, and then you start kind of picking and choosing the things, but then again, maybe those things are essential for you to do. So it's kind of like, how do you even know where to draw that line? I mean, I know if it gets super extremes, obviously you could figure it out, but.
I don't want to yet try to answer, but to people, like, those are real questions, right? I mean, like, that's quite valid, right? I mean, those are valid things to be asking, and one should ask that. So, you know, rather than trying to give a pat answer, which I think we could explore that, but I just want to pause by saying, like one should wonder those things, actually, right? Like, but yeah, let's keep going. I just want to see other, because I don't want to, those are complicated questions, so I think we should come back to them, but other qualms or questions that people raise.
Like the whole pantheon of the Buddhist story, like it's similar, very similar to like the Christian story or some other type of religion. You know, somebody came back to life after being totally dead, or the similar concept in Buddhism would be like reincarnation. You know, they never actually die, but their body dies.
So would that imply a question, even like, is it possible then for somebody to be a Buddha? What does that
Right,
mean?
exactly.
What does a Buddha mean,
Yeah.
actually? Yeah, and again, these are like, that's why, again, like, you know, so to put this at the beginning, in one way it's very skillful to put it at the beginning because you need a teacher in order to study, right?
Right.
And yet, in another way, if you contemplate it deeply, you know, so if you look at it superficially, it's easy, you know, but then if you look at it deeply, it raises complicated questions. You know, let's keep going, other qualms and questions, because, again, these are things one should come up against, right, as one contemplates.
So why is it necessary to stay with the teacher once, you know, you take a teacher? And then how does it work to have, you know, other teachers after that? You know, how does it work to say, okay, this is my teacher, but then to say, oh, well, this is my teacher, or, you know, and you gave examples of many teachers that you've had.
Yeah. Actually, that one I want to say something just because it's simpler. Actually, that's a simpler question. Like, these ones are much more complicated, I think. But I do want to say something about that one because, like, I think it was something I meant to cover today anyway, and I forgot. And that one is interesting too because what they suggest, actually there's a suggestion in Buddhism which I think is quite interesting, which is the Buddhist tradition itself suggests this. They say you should self-assess yourself, and what they basically say is a few things. One is if you find that you're very strong-minded, right, and like, maybe strong-minded is the wrong word, that you have that you're good at this, right, that you're naturally good at relating to spiritual teacher, and that like it's easy for you. They say then take lots of teachers, it's fine, you know. But they say if it's difficult, then be really cautious. You know what I mean? Like, that's one advice. So like there are some teachers who only have like one or two teachers, right? Actually, lineage masters, where you look and you say, wow, they only studied with like one person. Milarepa, right? He only had one Marpa. You know, like I think he had one other teacher, Marpa's student or something. But whereas Atisha had tons of teachers. But there's another thing too, which is so that's one is they actually advise that. But there's another thing too, which is this: is when they say stay with a teacher. This is what I meant to. This is actually the important part there. What they actually say is this: is it doesn't mean you have to keep studying with that teacher. What they mean in that is like, you know, if you view someone as your teacher in this sense, right? Then the Buddhist advice is, you know, then always hold them as your teacher in your mind, right? But the Buddhist view is like, again, it's quite flexible. It's a sense of you know, but go on and study with somebody. You know, it's like there's no conflict with that. With like the Buddhist view would be that there's no conflict with going on to study with somebody else. Then, you know, depending on where you're living, but also on what subject you want to study, on like, you know, what depth and things like. So they actually don't differentiate in that way. Like they would say, but just keep that person in your mind. You know, like, you know, so like the example I gave my first professor. I don't even know where he is. I don't even know if he's still alive or not actually anymore. I tried looking one time and couldn't find him. But that doesn't matter in that sense. So that's that part. You know, it's like, but that how many teachers and when to take on a new teacher, that, you know, that depends on kind of your own process of spiritual development and what you want to study and all that. But I think that's an interesting point too. That like, I'll say one other thought about that too is also because one thing you actually don't want to have is problems, right? Like, in other words, what we don't want to do is have. Especially also, I think it's quite. We could talk more about this sometime. Actually, now I realize it is a more complicated question. At least those parts are simple. But actually, as you get into it, it becomes complicated, right? Because lots of people end up with problems like that. So it actually is. It can be complicated. I mean, in one way, it's simple, right? Like, in other words, that because there is a thing like there are some teachers like that where you read stories where they were just like, well, everybody's the Buddha, so it's easy, you know, and then they go and take, you know, somebody they never met before was giving a teaching, and they said, oh, I took a teaching, and they're my teacher. But they actually they had a mind that was very easy with that. But then if you don't, it can be very complicated, you know, so, because, you know, what do you do if two teachers give contradictory advice, right? Or present a contradictory view of an important Buddhist, you know, if it's something simple, it doesn't matter, you know, if it's something that doesn't really matter, something peripheral, it doesn't matter. But if it's something really core, right, like how they explain emptiness, and they explain it two different ways, then you go, oh, wow, that's interesting. Right? That could be very good for you, or it could be bad, right? It depends on the student. For some students, that would be excellent, right? Like it inspires deeper thought, and that could be how they realize emptiness. You know, to somebody else, that could be a big problem that they're then worrying about the rest of their life. So you have to know yourself in part of it. It's part of that. So I don't think there is like a formulaic answer. It has to depend on who the student is. But anyway, yeah, it becomes more complicated. But other I just want to make sure we at least mention what other qualms that people had, or concerns, or questions, or like things that don't quite seem easy to wrap your mind around. Some people it was like totally easy. You just thought, oh yeah, it's easy. Buddha's Buddha, it's totally simple. Some people had. Did anybody have that time? It was like totally simple, straightforward, and easy topic. Gabe thinks it's easy.
No, we were talking kind of similar, like you know, we were trying to see if there was a problem with the faith that you had. Once you're like, okay, this person is my teacher, and it's like you kind of like did like the little checks, like, all right, is it teaching from the right scriptures and texts, and you know things like that. But then you kind of develop the faith, you know, and then when you start like, well, is he probably like an emanation of the Buddha or something like that, and then you're like, because you have faith, it kind of like throws your qualms away if you have stronger faith and you don't like question stuff. I don't know. So I don't know if there's a problem with that. Like you're not being inquisitive enough because you just believed in them. Not blind faith, because you have certain things that prove, but then you're like, oh yeah, he is, and then like you're not even going to question it. But it's not that you don't want to question it, but it's like, I don't know.
Yeah.
It's hard to explain.
No, I get it.
But once you go through the process of questioning, and you've made your decision, that is your teacher, your guru, then the questioning sort of stops.
Yeah, and it might be
The
the
trust
fact that they're
begins.
thinking about a specific teacher, and then you're like, well, with him, I can see him as that. But maybe if I think of another teacher, then I can start developing qualms. But we didn't get that.
And I'll raise one more qualm that relates to what your question was, like that relates to these 2 points. Is like, so let's say, actually I was talking to Lynn and I were talking about, like let's say, I'll take the example of Marpa, right? Like Miller, some of you are reading the biography, right? And Marpa was like really challenging for Milarepa, right? And also like if you read some of the stories of Naropa, like these great masters, right? Their teachers gave them incredibly hard time, like with Milarepa, right? There's a story where, you know, and actually you see it though, because when you're reading Milarepa's life story, you also know what Marpa's thinking, right? As you're reading it. So you know that Marpa's looking at Milarepa and going, he killed people, I've got to give him, he says, like, I've got to give him a really tough time, or he's never going to purify his negative karma, and he's never going to believe that he can be a good person. He's going to have to go through a lot of stuff before he can believe that before he can relate to his own essential purity. So I'm going to have to give him a hard time. And you see these conversations where Marpa's talking to his wife, and his wife's saying, be easier on Milarepa. And Marpa's saying, if I'm easy on him, he's not going to make progress. You know, like, I have to do this, or otherwise I'll never get enlightened. You know, like, I have to do this for him. But then, you know, then from Milarepa's side, you see Marpa coming out and, like, you know, kind of stumbling. So then Marpa walks out and starts acting drunk and says, I didn't tell you to build that tower. Why'd you build that tower? Rip that down and put all the stones back and start a tower over there. And I didn't want a round one. I wanted a square one. You know, like, right? And, like, from Milarepa's side, you're like, wow, that's tough, you know, like, and a lot of the story, right, and if you read the life story of, of Naropa, wow, I mean, like, Talopa was really, you know, like, the same thing, right, like, because he somehow knew that, Naropa's case, it wasn't that he had done something bad, like Milarepa had killed somebody, but he knew that Naropa, from having been this great scholar and, abbot or something, like, you know, that he had a certain, I think the implication in that story is that Naropa, as a younger person, had a certain arrogance that, that his teacher, you could get the sense in the biography that Talopa is kind of like, oh, I've got to really, like, break through his arrogance somehow, you know, and like, you see Talopa trying different things to try to break through that, and he finally does too. So, I guess my point is this, is like, actually, I'll say this, so when you read stories like that, they're quite entertaining in a way, you know, like they're fun, but I once joked with a friend of mine, like, I said, wow, but they're only fun because you know the end, like, I said they're fun because you know, well, Milarepa's Milarepa, and he gets enlightened, and Naropa's Naropa, and he gets, but I said, like, but if you were the person, I said, if you stop and think, well, what if I were Naropa at this point in the story, where he's like, you know, laying on the floor, you know, kind of bleeding and depressed and thinking, you know, life isn't worth living, or if you're, you know, Milarepa at the point in his story where he's like, it's totally hopeless now, you know, like he's like, you know, he's given up hope, right? And, you know, from the perspective of knowing the end of the story, it's like, oh, how funny, you know, he's gonna, but from the perspective of Milarepa at that moment, then it wouldn't be so funny, right? And I think it raises these, like it raises your question about, you know, like, cause you think, wow, how did Milarepa not say to Marpa, wait a second, this is ridiculous, you know, like,
Yeah.
you know, but he didn't actually, right? You know, he finally goes to the wife and, right, and sneaks away and goes to one of the, right, he finally sneaks away from Marpa to one of Marpa's students and takes teachings from him. And then he doesn't get any realizations, and the guy says, are you sure Marpa gave you permission? And Milarepa's like, yeah. But I guess it raises the question, which I think is interesting, is like, you think about it this way, like if you, like Milarepa and Naropa, right, were much more spiritually advanced than any of us, most likely. Is that a fair assessment? Maybe somebody here is better, you know, like. But since Milarepa achieved enlightenment in one lifetime and was the most famous saint in all of Tibetan history, we can guess that he was higher. He was a little ahead of us, let's say. Okay. I'm going to be bold. But Marpa had to do all that, right? Like Marpa gave him, and then Milarepa had to sit in that cave. You know, he had to go through so many, like, you know, he went through like incredible hardships on the path, right? That when the Dalai Lama talks about them, actually, like, I've said this before, I was there once when the Dalai Lama talked about that, and the Dalai Lama started crying, actually, when he thought about, actually, because it was clear that Milarepa is the Dalai Lama's, you know what I was saying, like, what's the word, role models, like, Milarepa is the Dalai Lama's role model. The Dalai Lama's been very open about that, right? And sometimes you see that, this is not just once, but numerous times, the Dalai Lama, you'll see where he takes off his glasses and he just starts weeping, like, at the thought of Milarepa's effort and sincerity and hardship, you know, in practicing the spiritual path, right? And so, but so I guess the point I want to get at is like when you think of a teacher, right? Then, so why is it? I'll just ask this question because I think it gets at these questions. Like, why is it that Marpa, you know, had Milarepa like rip apart? Was it 3 towers, right? Was it 3 or 4? I can't. He built at least 3. Maybe built 4. A 4th, I can't remember. Do you remember? It was 3 or 4 in the end.
There's a lot.
A lot, yeah. I mean, towers by hand out of rocks, and, you know. And why is it that, you know, but that like Khensa Rinpoche says, oh no, it's okay, don't worry, you know, have a good dinner, something like that, you know. And that Lama Zopa, like if you ask him, he might say, I'll do a lot of, you know, I'll make a bunch of satsangs or do a lot of prostrations or something like that. But he only says it if you ask, right? And, you know, like, and otherwise he doesn't tell you that, and you know, like, so, like, why is it that, you know, why is that actually, right? Like, and so I guess what I want to suggest is like, you know, I mean, I think it gets at this question you raised, right? Like, there is, you know, and I think it gets at your issue, what you were mentioning, Gabe, too, which is like, you know, I guess that's interesting, right? Like, if you have to imagine, like, if just say this right, like, that when Talopa looked at Naropa or when Marpa looked at Milarepa, right, they said they knew the level of devotion that they had, right? And they knew exactly how far they could push that person to overcome their own ego, right? And then, actually I'll share one more story and then I'll stop. But it was funny, like in the teachings actually it says, in the teachings for teachers, right, which you can read, you know, they're in the Lamrim and so on, right? It gives advice to the teacher, and what it says is this, it says, you know, if you meet somebody who's a beginner, right, who's not very advanced and not a very good student yet, give them gifts, talk nicely to them, like, be very sweet to them, you know, like sort of like, be very gentle, don't push them too hard, and, you know, and kind of don't challenge them too much, because they're not capable, you know, like in other words, so, you know, like, give them a cookie and, like, you know, and give them some gentle advice, basically, is the advice there. You know, and then it basically says, you know, but if the person progresses enough, stop, you know, then stop that. You know, you'll just enhance their ego, right? Like, whereas like, you know, like, so in other words, you know, and if the student's really great, then, you know, push them really hard. You know, so in other words, what Marpa was doing is in accordance with the Buddha's teachings, actually, right? And so, I guess that's why, just to me, it's an interesting point about this meditation. So how advanced you are in your practice of Guru Devotion, you can tell in part by how your teacher teaches. So if the teacher says, if when you see your teacher, like, oh, nice to see you, how are you doing, are you feeling okay? You know, then, you know, that's good. Right? But it's a sign that we haven't gotten very far. And that's okay. You know, like, you know, it's like how much ambiguity and how much tension can you handle, right? That, I mean, how much could Milarepa handle? That he could see Marpa as Buddha Abhadra, you know, and at the same time have Marpa be, I think, pretending to be drunk and telling him he had, you know, it's clear in the story he was pretending to be drunk, right? He says it to his wife beforehand, you know, and telling him to rip apart a tower he just built, right? Like, he knew Milarepa could handle a lot of ambiguity and a lot of, like, you know, that he could hold those two realities and relate on both levels, right? That he could relate to Marpa on a conventional level while still holding a absolute kind of vision. And so, so I think that's another way to, you know, just another interesting point as you contemplate these things is like, but isn't that funny though, that they actually, there's actual advice like that, right? So one time, I remember one time one of my teachers, he stopped, like, every time I saw him, he would give me some little gift, and then he stopped giving me gifts after a while, you know, and I thought, oh good, shoot. At least I'm making a little progress, he stopped giving me anything anymore. Okay. Anyway, so I just want to say, like, so next time we'll like, you know, we'll talk a little bit about more of this. But I really wanted to, like, I think it's good to explore the qualms. So maybe we'll go into some of those questions more next time. That's why I wanted to get them today, to sort of, because I think that's what makes this interesting or something. Because it is actually a very advanced subject, you know. So I don't think that anybody's going to sort of realize it fully at this point or something. But I think if we sort of at least address those questions, it's useful. But we should stop. So let's just dedicate any positive karma we've created together, any merit. So let's dedicate them that, you know, so first of all, so everybody, we ourselves and everybody else in the world, you know, and anywhere, right, can meet with, you know, totally, perfectly qualified, you know, Mahayana teachers, right, who embody patience, loving kindness, compassion, vast learning, wisdom, you know, deep meditative ability, you know, gain, you know, deep realizations of the Dharma, so that everybody can progress, you know, so, you know, and even if that, actually we don't want to say everybody has to be Mahayana, but I mean, you know, that everybody meets with teachers who embody those qualities, right, of compassion, wisdom, in whatever tradition they want to follow, actually. But to actually have those qualities of teaching a path that is qualified by wisdom, loving kindness, compassion, and that people can progress along that kind of path and achieve liberation and enlightenment. And also that in the world there can be peace, no war, no famine, you know, in families no conflicts and fighting, that people can grow up atmosphere of peace and kindness, that everyone can look at each other with compassionate eyes, and that no one can just do this too. Right? So and then the supreme jewel bodhicitta, where it is not arisen, where it arise and grow, where it has arisen, may it not diminish but increase more and more. We can do one in the snowy mountain paradise, you, the source of good and happiness, all-powerful Chenrezig, Tenzin Gyatso, please remain until samsara